This is one of the coolest things I've ever made. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I made my own Mjolnir using a 3D printer. Just kidding, I did not use a 3D printer to make this. Believe it or not, this Thor hammer started out as a piece of cardboard. I handcrafted this Thor hammer mostly out of cardboard, which took a lot of time and patience and pain and suffering. What am I doing with my life? In case you want to make your own hammer, there's a free template in the description, or you can just watch me make it. Either way, I hope this video gives you some good ideas for your next build. At the end of the video, I'll show you how to properly print out the template in order to accommodate whatever paper size you're using. After printing the template, I cut off all the borders so that I could tape all the template pieces together like a puzzle. Just so you know, I used a 3D model by Henrik 3D Creations to help me make many of the template pieces. If you haven't already, you should check out his Instagram. He's literally one of the best makers I've ever seen, so it's worth checking him out if you haven't already. Alright, so let's focus on this piece labeled A to start with. I traced this onto some poster board using a bit of masking tape to hold down the paper while I'm tracing. Then I can cut everything out using a sharp knife. Using a really sharp blade is actually one of the keys to making stuff out of cardboard, so it's important to regularly replace or sharpen your blade if you get into this hobby. I'll leave a link in the description to where I get my blades for cheap in case you're interested. Right here, I cut out a hole for the handle about 3 centimeters in diameter. And now you need to turn your attention to these dashed lines here, which represent where you need to fold the cardboard. Before folding, it's best if you lightly score the cardboard with a knife, which kind of relaxes the cardboard and makes it nice and easy to crease. You can also press down on all the folds with something like a pair of scissors, and that will make all the folds nice and sharp. These little tabs right here were the hardest to fold just because they're so skinny, but it's possible as long as you use the right tools and techniques that I just mentioned. Once I was happy with those folds, I super glued the flaps together like this. Now we'll move on to the piece labeled B. So just like before, the dashed lines need to be folded. You need to cut out piece B on poster board twice, and then those get glued right behind the little slit openings that we made earlier right there. See, it's coming together pretty nicely now. Next, we're going to cut out piece C and piece D. This time, instead of cutting these pieces out on a single sheet of poster board, I stacked 4 sheets of poster board on top of each other because piece C and D need a bit of height to them. When cutting out piece C and D, I've found that you get the best results when you do multiple light passes rather than trying to press down really hard and cut through it all at once. After that, I made a rectangle out of poster board right here so that I could glue piece C and D right next to each other and form this groove right here. At this point, I can take this whole thing and glue it to piece A, flip it to the other side, and do the exact same thing. So that means you need to cut out piece C and D twice, of course. Just like piece A, piece E also has some dashed lines on it which tell you where you need to fold. So following the exact same process as before, I folded all the dashed lines, then super glued the flaps together as seen here. Like before, I also cut a hole at the center right there about 3 centimeters in diameter, which is for the handle. Eventually, these two parts will need to be glued together, but because we need to add lights inside, we're going to leave them separated for now. Here we have piece F. Now this piece has some really skinny bits on it, so if you try to cut it out and then fold it, it'll be really tricky. So I actually folded the cardboard first before cutting the whole thing out, which helps a lot. For the runes on the hammerhead, I made a little paper template and glued that to a piece of poster board. In total, there are 8 of these rune panel thingies. So once I cut all 8 of those panels out, I basically tortured myself by puffy painting all the lines as cleanly and neatly as I could. By the way, if you're not familiar with puffy paint, it's basically just a type of paint that dries 3-dimensional. When the paint dries though, it does shrink a little bit, so I tried my best to kind of draw the lines a little thicker. One thing I always do when I'm using puffy paint is I'll just kind of practice on a scrap piece just to get the feel for it before I paint the real thing, and that always helps me get better results in the end. What I'm about to do here might seem kind of useless at first, but I can assure you it makes a difference in the end. Basically, I cut various pieces of some non-corrugated cardboard, the kind of cardboard that doesn't have that honeycomb thing on the inside. I glued those pieces of cardboard on the inside of the hammer, and my goal with that is sort of to give the illusion that the cracks have depth to them, and that the cracks are actual real cracks where you can see some inner material being exposed, if that makes any sense. I used both a glue stick and super glue here because the super glue tends to get absorbed by this type of cardboard really quickly, which makes it hard to use. So the glue stick kind of helps create a barrier so that the super glue doesn't soak into the cardboard as much. I probably could have just used a different kind of glue, but I like super glue because it dries fast. Since I want to make this hammer light up, we need something clear for the light to shine through, which is why I'm cutting up this plastic here. I think these are called acrylic sign holders, and I like these because they're thin enough to where you can just score it on both sides with a knife and then snap it off pretty easily. The plastic is a little slippery, so it helps to use a bit of tape to temporarily hold it in place while I super glue the plastic together like this. The idea here is to make the cardboard fit perfectly flush over the plastic, and this was actually a bit tricky. It sometimes took a few tries for me to get the plastic pieces to be the correct size, but eventually, with a bit of trial and error, I was able to get the plastic pieces to fit pretty snugly up against the cardboard. Hey, so I have a really quick announcement to make. I've decided to rebrand my YouTube channel name to Lord Sean's Crafts. What? Why? Huh? Oh, good question. Well, in case this certificate doesn't make it clear, I'm actually a landowner in Scotland now. Based on historic Scottish custom, a landowner in Scotland is referred to as a lord or lady. So you're a landowner in Scotland, which makes you a lord? Yep, I own 1 square foot of land in Scotland, thanks to Established Titles, the sponsor of this video. Established Titles offers a fun novelty gift for you or your loved one. Basically, they allow you to buy at least 1 square foot of dedicated land on a private estate in Edelston, Scotland. Each plot of land comes with an official certificate featuring a crest, a title of lord or lady, and a unique plot number in case you ever want to go visit your piece of land in real life. One thing I like about Established Titles is they actually plant a tree for every single order they get. They work with global charities One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future to support global reforestation efforts. Personally, I think this would be a funny last minute gift, especially if they're hard to shop for. Established Titles has told me that the first 200 of you who use my link below will effectively be next to my plot within a few minutes of walking distance. If you use the code Sean'sCrafts, you'll get 10% off, so go to establishedtitles.com/Sean'sCrafts and get your gifts today. Here's what we have so far, and now that all the plastic pieces are done, we no longer have to keep these 2 pieces separate. So at this point, it's a good time to super glue these 2 pieces together, and then we'll set it aside and come back to it later. Moving on, we're gonna create that circular piece at the top of the hammerhead with all the runes on it. To do that, I first started by stacking 4 sheets of poster board on top of each other, then I glued a paper template on top of that, and then I glued that whole thing to a piece of non-corrugated cardboard. That non-corrugated cardboard is very dense compared to the white poster board, which is easier to cut through. So as I'm carving out the runes, I'm sort of able to cut and peel the 4 layers of poster board on top, while easily keeping the brown cardboard at the bottom still intact. Some of these letters have a loop, like this one right here for example, and in those cases I always found it easier just to cut and glue a separate piece of cardboard rather than try to meticulously carve it all out in one shot. By the way, if you're enjoying this video and you want to help keep my channel going, all you have to do is just hit the thumbs up button, and that tells YouTube that you like this video and that YouTube should show this video to more people. So thank you. All the pieces that make up the hammerhead have now been made out of cardboard, so the next step is to harden the cardboard. For that, I'm using some Bongo fiberglass resin. I covered everything both inside and outside with a few coats, and afterwards I sprinkled a bit of baby powder to remove as much tackiness as possible before sanding all the pieces with 120 grit sandpaper, which gets rid of some high spots that formed from the resin. Once I was done sanding, I sprayed everything with a generous coat of filler primer. Filler primer, if you don't know, is basically just a really thick spray paint that's meant to fill in any tiny gaps and imperfections on the surface. After the filler primer dried, I sanded with 320 grit sandpaper, then hit everything with one more coat of filler primer, and finally did one more pass of sanding with some 600 grit sandpaper. Here's what all the pieces were looking like so far, and now I can go ahead and glue that disc piece to the top of the hammerhead using a bit of super glue. The next thing I need to do is crack the hammer, of course. So I gathered these photos of the hammer from various different angles and kind of edited them a little bit so I could more easily see where I need to draw the cracks. Now those photos I'm using there aren't really the best because at the time that I was doing this, the movie hadn't been streaming on Disney Plus yet, but thankfully I was still able to see a decent amount just by watching the trailers and teasers and all that stuff. To make the cracks, I start by using a cutoff wheel, which is really good at getting rid of a lot of material quickly, but because of that, it's not so good for achieving like fine detail. So that's where this little burr bit attachment comes in, which is a lot tinier and more nimble, so this bit allows me to add some finer detail to the cracks, as well as hit any spots that the cutoff wheel wasn't able to reach. This looks great, but now all that bare cardboard is exposed, so I decided to add some super glue to all the edges just to prevent them from like delaminating or fraying or peeling basically. And as you you can see, I used a needle tip for some of those hard to reach areas. Here are the paints I'm using. These are made by Alclad, and I'm gonna shoot these through a cheap airbrush and compressor kit which I got from Amazon. I did 2 coats of Alclad gloss black base, then after that I applied a coat of Alclad chrome. Now that 1 ounce bottle of chrome was not enough. I had to buy another 4 ounce bottle of chrome, so keep that in mind if maybe you're planning on using these Alclad paints. After I was happy with the chrome, I went over everything with some Alclad Aqua Gloss Clear. This clear coat will dull the shine of the chrome a little bit, but unfortunately that is kind of to be expected when you're dealing with chrome paint. For now, I only did 1 coat of clear, but later on down the line I'll come back and do a couple more coats. While that was drying, I sanded all the plastic parts with 120 grit sandpaper, and this is basically done in order to diffuse the light, so instead of seeing a bunch of individual LEDs, the light will kind of appear more evenly spread out. I waited for the clear coat to dry to the touch, and then I hot glued all those individual broken pieces of the hammer onto the plastic thing that we made earlier. Because this is all being done by hand, of course there's a ton of room for error, so I wasn't able to get all the edges of the hammerhead to line up perfectly, but I was still pretty satisfied with what I had. Right here, there's one piece that I did not glue onto the plastic, and that is because I am going to cut out a little door for the inside of the hammerhead. Basically, I need some way to be able to easily get in and out of the hammerhead so that I can have access to the battery pack, which will allow me to turn the lights on and off, as well as replace the batteries when they die. As you can see, I attached some little 8x3mm neodymium magnets here, using a bit of super glue and baking soda to keep the magnets stuck in place. And it's time for weathering. I mixed a little bit of water together with some black acrylic paint, and after applying the paint onto the hammer, I can kind of selectively dab and wipe most of the paint away in order to get the desired effect that I'm looking for. And afterwards, I airbrushed another coat of Alclad Aqua Gloss Clear. For the handle, I am using a PVC pipe with an outer diameter of about 1 1/8 of an inch. I cut the PVC pipe down to the size I wanted and sanded the plastic with some 80 grit sandpaper in order to roughen up the surface, which will allow the leather to adhere better. The leather that I'm using is just some basic leather that I found on Amazon, and even though this leather already has an adhesive backing to it, I still decided to use contact cement anyway because the adhesive is really weak and there's no way it would actually stay on there permanently. Of course, there's a bit of a seam right here, but I tried my best to keep it as clean as I could. Alright, next we gotta make all those little individual metal rings that wrap around the handle. I rolled some paper around the handle, and then I used a little paper template like this and traced that onto the paper tube. This is not really necessary, but I also slid this cardboard tube inside the paper tube so that I wouldn't crush the paper while I was cutting out the rings. If you don't happen to have a cardboard tube like that, you could also just roll up your own tube out of paper. I coated all the rings in super glue and then sanded everything with 220 grit. I also rounded off some of these edges like this because it would have been too difficult to accurately cut out all those rounded bits by hand. As you can see, at the very top of the handle there is a bit of a wider ring there, so like before, I made this ring out of paper and hardened it with super glue. Then I shaped it using 120 grit sandpaper along with my knife to kind of shave off the end in order to give it like a tapered look. I sanded once again with 120 grit, then more super glue to coat the raw paper, followed by 220 grit sandpaper. And now these paper rings are ready for paint, so I propped all the rings up onto some sticks just like this, and away we go with filler primer. Then 400 grit sandpaper, followed by more filler primer, then 600 grit sandpaper, followed by 2 coats of Alclad gloss black base, followed by Alclad chrome, and finally 2 coats of Alclad aqua gloss clear. And now the rings are ready to be glued onto the handle. Because the leather is ever so slightly compressible, I'm just barely able to get a needle tip underneath there and put a little drop of super glue on each side of the ring to hold it in place. Next up, let's make the pommel. I'm gonna start with making the bottom of the pommel first, and then slowly work my way up from there. As you can see, I wrapped a very thin strip of paper in a spiral pattern in order to create a taper. Now there's a leather strap that's supposed to go at the bottom of the pommel, so I marked and cut out a slit on each side of this piece so that later on I can feed the leather strap through those slits. And afterwards I sanded with 120 grit to try to level out the surface a bit. Right here, I rolled up a paper paper tube, and then using the template I cut out this little shape from the paper tube like this. And these two pieces go together like so. In the template you'll find a piece like this, and if you want you can lay some wax paper over top of that and trace the lines with a pencil. These pencil lines can then be easily transferred onto the pommel by using some pressure with a pencil to leave sort of an imprint. Using this wax paper method makes it really easy for me to replicate pretty much the exact same design on both sides of the pommel so that it looks symmetrical. Once I had all the lines on there, I once again used more puffy paint to draw on these lines as seen here. As usual, I coated the pommel in fiberglass resin, sanded with 220 grit, sprayed with filler primer, sanded with 400 grit, sprayed with more filler primer, sanded with 600 grit, and then I can lay down my Alclad. Once this dried, I applied my watered down black acrylic paint, making sure to leave most of the paint settled in the cracks and crevices. And when I was satisfied with the way that looked, I added my second coat of Alclad Aqua Gloss Clear. Next, I'm gonna go ahead and make the leather strap, and for that I used the same exact leather that I used before for the handle. And again, I'm using contact cement here because that seems to be the strongest and most flexible glue for this application. I super glued the leather strap to the pommel, and now the pommel is finished, so I can mix up some 5-minute epoxy and use that to permanently attach the pommel to the rest of the handle. The lights inside the hammer are just these battery-powered LED strips that I found on Amazon. Of course, I'll make sure to leave a link below to where I got these. As you can see, I made a little cardboard box that I could glue all the LEDs onto, and this cardboard box was made simply by printing that hammerhead template at 50%, which I found was the perfect size and leaves enough room for the battery pack to fit inside the hammerhead as well. I hot glued that cardboard box onto the handle, and then I attached some magnets to the battery pack using super glue and baking soda. The baking soda is nice because it makes the super glue dry almost instantly and also makes for a stronger bond too. And of course, by adding these magnets, I can easily take the battery pack in and out of the hammerhead whenever I need to replace the batteries. I went ahead and mixed up some more 5-minute epoxy and used that to attach the handle to the hammerhead. And these two pieces can finally be glued onto the hammerhead now that the LEDs are inside. At this point, I decided to add some light damage to the hammer using a bit of sandpaper. And of course, I don't want to overdo this part or anything. I just want to add some very subtle imperfections on the surface, as I think this makes it look more like real metal. Finally, I brushed on one last coat of Alclad Aqua Gloss Clear, and then I was finished.
Tend the garden with me. We have so many seeds to sow. When the harvest comes in, it will be time to share what we have grown. We were having the time of our lives when we started.
As promised, I'm now going to show you how to properly print out the template. So first, you need to download Adobe Acrobat Reader. There's a link in the description to where you can download this for free, and it only takes like 2 minutes to download. After you've downloaded the template, you'll notice that there's 3 files here: template number 1, template number 2, and template number 3. Right click on template number 1, then open with Adobe Acrobat Reader DC. Click the printer icon, select the poster format, then set the overlap to 0. Also, make sure the tile scale is set to 100%. After that, you want to specify what type of paper you're using. It's probably either A4 or US letter, but for me it's US letter. And now it's ready to print. If you would like to print this template smaller so that you can make that little box with the LEDs, just follow the exact same steps except click size instead of poster and change the custom scale to 50%. On the right you'll see a preview for what you're printing, and if for whatever reason the template pieces are getting cut off the page, you can always just print in the poster format, which prints using multiple pieces of paper in the case that what you're printing doesn't fit on a single sheet. For template number 2 and template number 3, they should be able to fit on a single sheet of paper, so you can just click size, make sure the scale is set to 100%, and specify what type of paper you're using. And it's that simple. If you liked this video, then you might like my previous video too, where I made a Moon Knight mask, so click the screen right here if you want to watch that. Thank you very much to my patrons for supporting me on Patreon, and thank you for watching.
When we started.